You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everybody, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, Star Trek The Next Generation podcast, hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there that we're releasing all of these episodes on YouTube for free. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay, and you?
I'm doing well. We are at the end of Season 2, so 22 episodes in, and as happy as I am to be here, I kind of feel like tonight we're reviewing a little bit of a shit episode.
Right.
Tonight we are reviewing Shades of Grey, Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 2, Episode 22, which debuted on July 17th, 1989, with a star date of 4297 6.1 in the year 2365. According to Memory Alpha, which I've found interesting, this is the first official clip show in Star Trek history. The Menagerie, which debuted in the original series,
Which was the pilot, wasn't it?
Well, it took clips from the pilot, The Cage.
That's right. The Cage. Yeah. Okay.
And used it to tell another story about Captain Pike after his
Right.
injury.
Right.
In the two-parter of The Menagerie. But
Yes.
apparently that was not considered a clip show because they actually built a story around those clips.
Exactly.
Versus, I think, what we got here. So let's just dig into the story real quick.
Sure.
It's very, very simple. So the Enterprise D is orbiting an unexplored planet in the Serata 4 system. And an away team of Geordi LaForge and Commander Riker are on the surface in an alien swamp, which is very humid and covered in lush jungle, doing a geological sweep. LaForge finds Riker sitting on a log with an injury. Something seems to have bitten or pierced his leg. Geordi, not taking any chances, calls up to Dr. Pulaski and Chief O'Brien in the transporter, asking to see if he can beam Riker up for a medical examination. Because of Starfleet protocols and the transporter technology, Chief O'Brien is given an alert from the biofilter in the transporter that Riker has been infected with some sort of identified microbe. Dr. Pulaski appears and beams down to the surface, where she is able to determine that Riker is able to be beamed up and gives a medical override, so she is able to transport him to sickbay. Once he gets to sickbay, he begins to suffer neurological impairment to the point of I think he falls. Is he unconscious before?
He goes into a coma.
Right.
Yeah.
I think he does right before the signature of the show. Right. And basically what happens from there is they discover that a creature on the planet that is in the form of a vine actually struck Riker in the calf and left a blue thorn that transmitted into his body a microbe that is slowly working up his nervous system to his brain. And ultimately, the way they solve this issue is they trigger negative brain patterns to counter the neural parasite, and through the magical voodoo of science fiction,
they put electroprobes into his brain,
right?
And then they electrically stimulated his brain. And where the clip scenes come into it is because give you the answer to this. There was a writer strike going on, so they said, "Well, we let's do a clip show." So they
Well,
pulled all of these. So they neurostimulate Riker, and he has dreams, and he has all kinds of different dreams: adventurous dreams, danger dreams, erotic dreams, so on. And they figure out that if they produce negative dreams with negative endorphins, which I have no clue what that are. They are.
yeah,
It has some adverse. It acts like an antibiotic to this rickettsial-like organism because it's a bacteria, but it's a parasite, so it's like a virus. Then,
well,
so
yeah.
so anyway, the creation of these negative endorphins is what saves Riker's life, and I don't know anything about that. This science is based on any real science. I don't know. It could be.
So, uh, I'm guessing not. I've never heard of neurochemicals having a positive or negative connotation to them.
They are what they are. Right.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
So, this is a little bit of Star Trek science fiction magic.
Yes.
The interesting. So, I do think there's some interesting things in the episode. I think this unidentified planet in the
Barada.
It was no, it was not Barada. Sarada.
Surata. Okay.
Barada was a planet in a previous episode, and there was a Barada for, but Sarada for. So one thing that they are able to discern from the planet is that a lot of the vegetation is actually predatory and carnivorous, and that much of the biomatter around them, including what seems to be the liquid that they're stepping in. It may not necessarily be water. I think data says that there are organic compounds in it that make it seem that the entire jungle is basically a large digestive system, and they are actually standing in the juices of previously digested organisms, and that the entire jungle around them is actually kind of just this giant predatory plant. I think that from a exobiology perspective, and Data being an exobiologist, I think that that's actually a pretty interesting thing to come across in the galaxy, and
It
it's
is.
not.
Yes.
I don't think that that would necessarily be out of the realm of possibility of finding of finding a planet. Maybe not, an entire forest that is one giant predatory organism, but finding larger plants somewhere in the universe that feature predatory or carnivorous um, digestive systems or hunting patterns or something like that. I don't think that that is necessarily out of
I
the
think.
question or
I think.
pure science fiction.
No, I think that there could be an exoplanet that would be in the right temperature and light zone, and particularly if there was parallel development so that you had some way to do photosynthesis, convert light into sugars and so on. Um, whether it would be the one question I have, since it said it was a carnivorous forest, and it's like
Yeah,
it's almost like you were on the inside of this huge intestine when you're on the surface of the planet. My only practical question would be, with the idea that something could possibly evolve like that, what was the prey? What were they? If the whole
right.
part of the forest had to be just regular non um, non velociraptor like plants, and others were the actual predatory plants. But the question is, all right, if you have that sort of system, what do they feed off of?
That's a very good question because there was no other living animal life, and I think they
Yeah,
made a point of uh, specifying that when
right,
Geordi and Data go
right.
down.
Yeah,
Um, One interesting thing that I thought to mention here in terms of Geordi and Data going down the second time to get the sample after Picard orders them to go down. Data makes a really good point before they get on the transporter pad that it really would be safer for him to go down because they know there is inherent risk to organic beings like Riker and Geordi. Geordi makes an argument that he's coming anyway, and they both go down, but they have this scene where um, Data is looking at the plant that will turn out to be the culprit for striking Riker. And the plant doesn't react to Data because Data doesn't have any neurological or biological function that would make him seem like a mammalian animal that this plant would need to attack and consume. Geordi, however, has the suspicion and makes kind of a joke that he expects Data's reflexes to save him just in case. I do find, all the humor of this scene aside, and I think it's a really good. There are a pair of really good scenes between LeVar Burton and Brett Spiner, who are always great together. Um, this seems like one of those arguments that Maddox would have made in A Measure of Man. That look, you're going out into space, and you have someone like Data, and you can send them down to a planet, and they are essentially impervious to so many environments that you would want to make a lot of datas and maybe have a data on every ship in your fleet for moments like this where you don't know what you're going to be facing. And this is, besides some of the obvious problems with the away team going down to an uninhabited, unexplored world without any protective gear. Um, it seems like you could really mitigate a lot of this by just sending Data down in the first place. But we'll get into that when we talk about the writing of the show. You're about to say something. I'm
No,
sorry.
but that's an interesting point because it also reflects something we've talked about before, that maybe the best way to initially explore some of the outer planets in our solar system is to use robotic ships
Right.
or robots, and we've already done that with the deep space probes. Are actually robots whose function is to collect data or images and so forth. So
And our Mars explorers.
yeah. So if you really look at it, we've been using multiple uh, copies of similar. I mean, the Voyagers were similar, Mariners were similar. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
these space probes are very similar, whether they're American or Russian, Chinese, or European built. So it makes perfect sense to do it this way because we're actually doing it now.
Right. And I think that Star Trek sometimes stumbles on the obvious application of this.
Hmm.
I think in the danger of exploring the wider galaxy, I don't know. It seems. I think if you find M class planets, the variety of life in flora and fauna and just the different environments would probably produce so many unique and novel dangers that I wonder what the process would actually be to exploring places like this. Um, so they're sending, Riker and Geordi down into this uninhabited world to explore it the first time. How many times have they scanned this planet beforehand? What's the kind of Starfleet protocol? It, is this something that they just randomly do? I have to imagine, and I kind of hope in the future, one thing that's probably considered is um, how long it takes us to approach certain things like a new planet.
Well, yeah, it gets into my concern was since they talked about a biologic agent that infected Riker. When you brought the protocol, you know, what actually happens or should happen if we had a
Mm-hmm.
starship and we find an M class planet and it has an atmosphere? We can use spectroscopy and so forth to determine what the gaseous makeup of the atmosphere is, whether there's anything toxic. But then there's the whole issue of, I mean, we're in the midst of a pandemic with a coronavirus, which people thought would be gone by now, and it's not, and it's not going to be gone for a while. So when you go to, a planet that has some life, how do you assess whether there's any biologic hazard by just going down there? And if you go onto the surface, if it's, the gravity and so forth, you might have to, whether you'd have, you know, your own air supply or not. Um, should you go in a biohazard suit um, until you can assess what biologic aging? I mean, that's one of the thoughts we haven't talked about before, but if there really has been human contact with alien races, have they given some humans a broader
Oh,
disease,
right,
or have humans infected them with measles, or there's this big radio
right,
message going out around the outside the solar system: don't go to Earth. They have put a big yellow flag up. It's quarantined. you
right.
know
Well, I think that's a really good point. There's a lot of um, well, there's so many unknowns to face just on the microbial level that the risk of intergalactic exploration, especially on a kind of exoplanet um, premise, really takes on a entirely different sort of risk, and maybe even a different set of rewards too, because I've often wondered what happens when we finally send humans out to like Proximus. Well, is it Proxima B? Yeah, I think Proxima B is
Mhm.
a Earth-like planet, and then is Alpha Centauri?
Perhaps, yeah.
Um, but when we finally send out a ship to one of these Earth-like planets, which at this point it looks like it will probably be something like a generation ship if we get there. Um, you know, the possible resources and the time it would take to explore places like this if they're uninhabited, which we don't know. Um, I've always thought that there's the chance, like, we send a generation ship there, someplace like Proxima B, and they land on Proxima B thinking no one's there, and they get there and there's like cities and entire people like, oh hi. Um,
So, one comment is, if you remember when the Apollo astronauts came back from the moon, they were in isolation for like a week to make sure they didn't pick up
right.
some, Andromeda strain type thing. And
Well, yeah.
and the other thing about this, maybe in a sense, this is the kind of strange thing about this actual microbiologic scenario, because, yeah, look, you beam down to a planet. The question is not answered: is there any assessment of biologic risk or hazard
Hmm.
before somebody beams down? Well, we don't know the answer. Somebody beams down, they pick up a foreign bacteria, but there's a biofilter that when they
Hmm.
beam back up, it removes it. So, what was so unique about this
Right.
organism that infected Riker that the biofilter didn't take it out? Again, is it just part of creating the, it's a question that's not answered. A lot of, you know, viewers may not have thought about it, but it's again a writer's trick, or not a trick, but the writers change the rules so they can make a story.
So a little bit of background on the episode, I think, actually will answer some of these questions. Um, so in the season, they had spent a lot of money in certain episodes, like Elementary Dear Data, which included really big sets, and often the production of those episodes would take up to a week. One of the agreements that they had made with the studio in being able to produce Elementary Dear Data is that the studio wanted something called a bottle episode. And a bottle episode is where like you use the sets that you already have on hand and you don't have any major guest stars or anything like that. It's usually just the cast. And you'll actually notice that in this episode, you see everyone from the cast actually appear. They don't actually have a lot of lines or anything like that, but the entire crew is there from Wesley all the way up to Jean-Luc Picard. This is also the last episode for Dr. Pulaski, but we'll get into that in a sec. So one of the things that they had to do with this episode is that they had to make it a bottle episode, but they also had to make it a 3-day episode. And What they mean by 3-day episode is that they had to produce the entire thing in 3 days. Part of that is because of the writer's strike, but part of that too was they were kind of bound with their agreement with the studio that they were with at the time to produce this kind of episode, which no one ended up liking. And, one thing that we should acknowledge, Shades of Grey is considered one of the worst episodes in Star Trek history. And I have to agree, it really is a bad episode. But I'm sorry.
No. I agree with you. And I think one of the questions I had thinking about it is why the title of this episode? How does the hell does it relate to the
I
story?
have no idea. I have no idea whatsoever. Honestly, the there are so many things that are wrong about this episode,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that, like, in season 1 we had an episode end with basically nothing happening. They go to the neutral zone and they have this face off with the Romulans, and nothing happens. Like, there's kind of a hint that the Borg are there. Um,
Oh
kind of
yes,
a
right.
dud, kind of a dud of an episode, considering that the episode beforehand they ended a conspiracy within Starfleet, from those creatures from that
Mm-hmm.
unknown part of the galaxy that we've
Mm-hmm.
never heard from again.
Mm-hmm.
This is I think the last episode that we watched before this was not it's the Stratagema episode.
Yeah.
Why can't I not remember its name for the life of me at the moment? Oh, Peak Performance.
Yeah.
Peak
Yes.
Performance is a really great episode.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone enjoys that episode. You and I both enjoyed that episode immensely. Um, but here we are at the end of season 2, and we're having a clip show, and it's so anticlimactic, and it is kind of indicative to everything that's been wrong with the first 2 seasons. There's so much uneven storytelling.
Well, I just thinking. I don't think when you look at the last episode of season 1 and the first episode of season 2, I can't recall. There was no really transition story.
No,
And this, I haven't peeked ahead and don't know, what the first episode of season 3 is. But my guess is, again, there's not going to be any transitional story like
no,
there were in Enterprise, and probably I think that happened probably in Deep Space Nine and uh,
right.
and so on.
Well, one thing that, and I mentioned her previously. This is Diana Mulder's last episode as Dr. Pulaski. She is going to leave the show right after this episode, and they will be bringing back Gates McFadden in season 3 as Beverly Crusher. Part of that is so. One thing that we will be discussing here and throughout the rest of the seasons as we go forward with where no Bubs has gone before is the removal of Gene Roddenberry as kind of the voice of what Star Trek is supposed to be, and the ascension of Rick Berman as the main producer and kind of the showrunner in terms of deciding where the creative content of Star Trek goes. Um, I think it's good to mention at this point that Gene Roddenberry at the end of season 2 has basically removed himself from all of the creative aspects of Star Trek. Right now, it's Rick Berman and Michael Pilar and Maurice Hurley running the show, with Gene basically overseeing the scripts and giving his input. There's a lot of arguments on set, and Gene will continue to be giving his input well until I think season. I think it goes into season 4, because Gene is going to die in October of 1991. And from there on, Star Trek is going to be a very different show going forward, in the fact that it will start addressing aspects of the Federation that you and I have been talking about throughout the show, but the storytelling will be focused on it directly. For example, the idea that the Federation is not this perfect kind of institution that allows just ultimate peace and prosperity and equality, even within its own um, governance and purviews. Um, we will start looking at some of the aspects of how race is depicted in Star Trek, especially how issues of gender and feminism are discussed, because Rick Berman has some very misogynistic overtones in his storytelling that we will have to address. But I think one thing that needs to be talked about in regards to season 1 and season 2 is Gene's vision of what he thought the future is going to be, and this is what's going to kind of take up the bulk of the rest of this episode,
Mm-hmm.
and probably going into the next episode as well, because by the time we get to the beginning of season 3, it's very much Rick Berman and a writer named Michael Pillar who are um, handling a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to the creative of Star Trek: The Next Generation. But to get into it, one thing that Gene thought about the future is that there would be no more interpersonal conflict among humanity, and that any sort of um, personal animosity between human beings would be removed from us as individuals, and that there would be no acrimony, there would be no hatred. We would be living in kind of this utopian society built on love and understanding and justice. From what you've seen in season 1 and season 2, do you think that is the society that is depicted in Star Trek: The Next Generation?
We talked about this, touched on this before, in that, um, you know, the, I mean, even going back to the Enterprise series, which was, was supposed to be before the original series, in that Enterprise, there was this, Earth had gone through World War III, and
Right.
from Cochrane developed warp drive and first contact and so forth. And it seems like in this Star Trek history, the trauma of World War III finally brought people together, where they, first had regional governments, but it sounds like they really formed a world government and put the past cultural, well, not cultural, but political divisions aside. And they may have had such problems just to survive that they had to come all together. Thus, it does give the sense that, and this gets into the next generation, where it's Troy's explaining to Mark Twain in one episode, future episode, where we've eliminated poverty, and, racism is not an issue because we've got blue people on this ship and so on. So I think that he,
We have blue people.
he was
That's a great line.
He was, well, that's what Mark Twain said. I like that blue gentleman over there, and but I think it does paint the picture that there was basically, one main government on Earth. We didn't have
Yes.
the political brinksmanship and conflict that we have now, and that put Earth in a position that it could form a relationship with Vulcan and Andoria and all these different places, but that's where, we said before, if in the Star Trek universe, Earth is, conflict free. I mean, there's going to be personal differences and humans being humans, even then. But then when Earth goes out and starts talking to these other species on other worlds, it's like, oh, we have to go through this same whole process again of getting people to understand that we all are one, and it's just so wasteful to, in a sense, to compete and be Ferengi and all of this sort of thing.
Well, if you even think about it, like, we talk. This is a Star Trek: The Next Generation show, but we often have to go back and cite the original series, Voyager and DS9. But we also have to cite Enterprise too, because those shows are considered part of the canon and part of the history. You know, you mentioned the trauma of World War III. What about the Zindi attack on Florida, where they literally,
Oh,
like, they literally scraped a hole through, like,
oh,
they cut Florida in half.
yeah. I mean, that's really interesting because it was like 9/11 on steroids, with 7 million
Right,
people were killed. And remember when who was it? Phlox went down to Earth during one shore leave. He experienced a lot of racism basically
right.
because it was these Zindi, these non-humans, reptilians, and bird people, and all of that caused this attack. So anybody who on Earth that wasn't human, there was great suspicion. In the same way that we had the anti-Muslim, attitudes
Right.
after 9/11, or even the increased anti-Asian
I
stuff that's been
so
going on after the Chinese virus.
well, I want to actually mention it, and it's very good that you mentioned like the current issues that we're facing now, especially with anti-Asian sentiment due to the possible lab leak theory in Wuhan. Um, which whatever the reason is for the spread of COVID from China to the rest of the world, it doesn't excuse the treatment of people in an undignified manner, no matter who they are, or where they're from. Um, I think I think one thing that we have to talk about when it comes to the show now is that we've really identified a real divide where Roddenberry had this idea in the future that people had somehow let go of the trauma that they had experienced in their past history and had moved to this kind of utopian relationship with each other. But you know, it's very clear that Rick Berman writes stories where there's these imperfect people in space who deal with things that actually affect them. I mean, even if we're going by Ron's um, vision that nobody is kind of this morally or ethically imperfect individual, it's really going to be hard to explain things like Data's Data's moral and ethical struggles when he's kidnapped. I forget the episode, but he's kidnapped by someone, and this person literally enacts such cruelty on Data and to people around Data that Data considers murdering him at the end of the episode. Like, you can't tell those kind of stories if you believe this idea that everyone in the future is this just perfectly ethical being. Um, it's just not possible in a way because if all conflict is over, what causes conflict?
Well, is the sort of the lesson here on a practical basis, looking at history into the future, that Roddenberry was trying to present um, an image of what the future could be, and it was like
Right.
theory. But then, just like getting back to a conversation we had beforehand, talking about the concept of revolution, that one of the big problems with revolutions, I mean, even the American Revolution that we were talking about, people want to go through the process of creation through destruction. You destroy
Right.
the old to create the new. There's a good understanding or good arguments as to why you want to destroy what exists, has existed, but there's
Yes.
not always a clear picture of what you want the outcome to be. And if you look at the French Revolution and and the Russian Revolution and even the American Revolution, it wasn't firm as to what was going to come out of it. And if you look at the French Revolution versus the American Revolution versus the Russian Revolution, they're all revolutions, but the results were very different. course, you got to take into context the political environments and the philosophical thinking and so on. But that gets into, you know, is this a practical lesson that, yeah, again, this is what we'd like to see, but in practice, from a practical basis, how do we actually get there? I mean,
Well, I think
this is a current discussion today. The UN report comes out, and it's devastating, and damage has been done to the climate that we will not be able to reverse for possibly centuries,
right.
if then. And um, but then the question is, well, we've got ideas how to do this, but we're not quite sure because we don't have a holistic global plan, which is what is needed at this point.
Right.
Maybe we're getting there.
Well, I think the I think when it comes to I think Roddenberry came from a lot of difficult places when he formed the vision for Star Trek. Um, you and I previously discussed a few days ago when we were doing quote unquote pre-production for the show on the phone that he flew 82 combat missions in World War II. I also wanted to bring up what he had been suffering since the late 80s. Uh, Roddenberry was likely affected by the first manifestations of cerebral vascular disease and encephalopathy as the result of his long-standing recreational use of legal and illicit drugs, including alcohol, methaqualone. Um,
Quaaludes, as they used to be called.
okay, quaaludes.
Right.
He abused Ritalin, Dexamyl, uh, or Dexedrine, and
Mm-hmm.
apparently was a frequent user of cocaine, which was apparently an issue on the set of Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Mm.
Uh, to help stimulate his work and especially his writing routine, which I did some research on, he would often supplement them with amphetamines. So I think to a certain extent, Roddenberry um, may have come to his viewpoint completely out of his gourd. If I could give you a clinical summation, I think Roddenberry probably had seen a lot of suffering in the world, and in the midst of having to deal with his own demons and personal issues, did what a lot of creative people do, had a vision of this kind of utopian moment or utopian society. I kind of have my own utopian vision as an author, though it's not a society necessarily. Um, I think the problem with Roddenberry's vision ultimately is that it's colored by this sense of absurdity that you can't really have to if you want to achieve the advancements that we see taking place in the 24th century. We made a comment previously when we were talking about space exploration and surviving in space and the colossal amount of effort and work and the toll it takes just in our current modern day to keep the space station, the International Space Station, going. It literally takes for I think there's 75, anywhere from 30 to 75 people sometimes up on the space station.
I don't think it's that
There's a
many. Yeah,
there's
I
a
don't think
how
it's
many
that
people
many.
are up on the space station?
Yeah, it's look.
How many people are on the space station right now? Oh, an international crew of 6 people. Never mind. Don't listen
Yeah,
to me.
it's relatively small. Yeah,
Yeah, 6 people.
so
What am I talking about? Anyway, you have hundreds of people, teams of hundreds of people working every day to basically keep 6 people alive in the
mhm.
most inhospitable place uh, imaginable. in a bunch of cans that essentially smell like shit because space smells a little bit like burnt steak and shit.
Hmm.
I think the only way you get there is by kind of having a hard nosed approach that I don't. This is going to sound bad, and I may have already said some bad things, but I don't think you get to the Federation without a certain level of militarism. And I don't think you get to a United Earth without a certain level of militarism. And I don't think that you get to Roddenberry's quote unquote utopian society without people having to give up a lot of things along the way culturally to have that happen. Um, the the fascinating thing about Star Trek: The Next Generation is a lot of these stories, especially in season one, had to do with the crew running into cultures they had never met before, and the stark differences and tensions that arose from that. And often these tensions and differences were the impetus for the conflicts in the stories themselves. The one I'm thinking about at the moment is Justice, where they go down to that planet where they
Hmm.
have that invisible god
Hmm.
station above, and Wesley
Hmm.
Crusher, of course, ruins a garden and has to be put to death. Um, I think the problem with Roddenberry's vision is that there's no explanation to how. Okay, you had World War III and you had the augments, and you had this period of essentially what seems to be like a second dark age before Zephyr Cochrane, basically took a nuclear missile and shot himself into space. Um, there had to be something after Zephyr Cochrane that brought societal cohesion together, and it seems in Enterprise there's a very militaristic side to the United Earth before the
The
Federation.
the Makos, they referred to them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that the larger society that makes something like United Earth happen is probably militarized on some point. And, the one of the jokes that's often made among fandom in Star Trek is that the future is space communism. I am not sure after watching Enterprise and now watching aspects of the Next Generation that the future is space communism. I'm not sure about that. I think that it's very clear that they have some sort of standing military force,
Maybe it's going to
and
be
that the
maybe
interaction between the military and general society is much more interlaced, even maybe now than what ours is in the modern world.
what in Starship Troopers did they refer to the Earth government, the Federal Service or something like that?
Yeah,
Remember? And
yeah, I
you
think
couldn't
so.
become a citizen unless you joined the Federal Service. Remember that?
Yeah.
And that
Well,
was that was a very militaristic world government.
I don't think that Star Trek goes that far in terms of
No,
what
no, no. But I think the whole thing here is, I mean, you brought up an interesting
I
point.
think they have more societal organization than we do.
Yes, and see, this is where it's just interesting when you think about Gene Roddenberry. I mean, to what percent is Star Trek and the all the thinking that's flowed out of it, and the additional story writing and the topics explored through the science fiction, story. How much of this is from a drug-addled brain? And and
Yeah.
that's not necessarily bad because I think there's a lot of people who you know are may not be drug addled, but they might have some really bizarre mental processes going on,
Mm-hmm.
that artists and so forth, that creates a lot of uh, opportunity for people to find new meaning in things. And I think
Right.
that's one of the exercises we're going through, I think one of the main things that you and I talk about is really is okay, is Star Trek the future, and is it pointing to a future we could possibly have? And part of this discussion can filter down into, well, how do we actually get there?
Right. Well, I think Roddenberry has this notion that when we're there, part of the reason we're there was the elimination of conditions like scarcity. Like it's very clear that people act very different when they don't have to worry about scarcity. Even though, we come to figure out, I think, in later seasons and in other shows that like no, there is a sense of scarcity and they still have to trade and they still have to have economic concerns and stuff like that. But the philosophy of what governs their society and what kind of spurns the impetus for what they go for isn't necessarily built off of this idea that we need to consolidate our resources or that we need to expand our power base so we can get more resources. There's this philosophical idea, it seems, that the ultimate resource is the personnel. Like, this is going to sound very corporate, but like the people that make us are our workers. Um, I think there is a very humanistic side to the Federation, um, but I don't know what I'm trying to.
It goes back to the discussion we were having about someone you talked to recently, and
Oh
that
yeah,
you put, you're talking
right,
about this Marxist friend or acquaintance
yeah.
that you both agree that you really need to put humanity before profits, and
Well,
and
yes.
I think that's what Gene Roddenberry, or Star Trek is representing here.
Well, not only like materialistic profits, but social profits as well, or like the social the power that once you remove scarcity and once you remove like materialism, and let's go super lefty on this one, once you remove capitalism, you still need to remove the impetus for people to want power or want to be popular or want to be celebrities. Like you really need to have people remove their ego from the scenario, but not only on a societal level but on an individual level. Like for example, I think a good example of what I'm talking about on a societal level, in the future, the idea of, let's say, I think that there is like a coalition of African states in the 24th century on Earth. Like, one thing about United Earth is that they're not just one big massive body. It's not like, oh, there's North America. Like, there's the African Congress, and then there's like the North American League, and there's all these different groups that are coming together as United Earth. So, I think what is being alluded to there, possibly in the world building, is that even in the future, even though there's a united Earth within the Federation of Planets, they still have their own governing systems.
It sounds like
Part
it's like a United States of Earth, but the states are much bigger geographically.
right, and I think part of the reason that is able to work is that everybody has to make a sacrifice on certain things like, okay, we're going to have our African Union over here, but we don't have any more sovereignty than the North American League has over here. Like there, and no one in the African Congress is saying that the African Congress is the greatest like nation on earth. Just
And
like no one in the North
and
American League is over here saying, the North American League is the greatest thing ever. They're sharing resources. They're essentially working together. If anything, their names are the geographic designations of where they live, and that alone.
and people in the future, if you're part of the North American League, then that may mean that there be no border between what is now Mexico, the United States, and Canada.
Well, it could
Just
even
like one of the things the European did along with the European Union, they did the Schengen Treaty, So all these
Right.
European member states, you can drive, from one to the other just like you can here. No
Well,
checkpoints, all that.
well, I think the entire idea of sovereignty and the entire idea of borders, or even like the societal division of nations, is just gone. And I
Well,
think that's really the only way you make something like that work in the future. And I think
what
Roddenberry's pointing to that too, and saying like we've gotten rid of these certain egotistical things like
it,
nationalism and
it,
sovereignty and having individual. Sorry,
it
go
that
ahead.
this egotistical shift is very important because again, you know, the people of Earth are more or less going to have to act as a unified species because they're dealing again as a planet, as a species, with totally different planets and
Right.
species.
Well, getting back to my point of like the only way this really works is if people give up things culturally. Like you can't have in the future. I remember there's an episode later on, I think it might be season 4. It's the episode where Keiko and O'Brien get married and they have Data doing the narration of the episode. And at one point, he notes that like today's a day where there's like 3 crew transfers, 2 weddings, 2 births, 1 funeral, the Hindu festival of lights. I think one thing that happens in the future is that you still have, like for example, you would still have Christians, but you wouldn't have Christians who believe that the primacy of the religion overrides all others. Just like in the 24th century, you would still have Muslims, but you wouldn't have Muslims that think that people that aren't Muslims are infidels. Like there would have to be a real cultural change within these institutions for institutions like that to survive
Oh,
into the
yes.
future.
Yes.
Um, and I think like I don't think Roddenberry is necessarily anti-religious. From what we know of the man in his personal conversations behind the scenes with certain philosophers, he definitely believed in some sort of divine presence or the idea of God. Maybe not an old man in disguise determining all fate and destiny, but Roddenberry was not adverse to the idea of spirituality. I think in the future there is going to have to be some sort of agreement of basic dignity that overrides all things, including personal ideas of like revenge or honor. For example, I don't think in the future they would have. Um, I think they would. I think this is going to sound very odd when I say it out loud, but it should make sense to the listener. Um, they won't have executions, but they'll have euthanasia. Do you know what I mean by when I say that?
Sure. Yeah.
Like, there will be a stressing of human dignity to a level of indiv- the only real sovereignty I think that you will see in the future, and I think you see it in terms of the people that work in Starfleet and the people that are working outside of Starfleet in a civilian manner. Like, you will truly be able to have a society where the individual is actually free to pursue themselves in a way that is outside of the material constraints of, having to work the 9 to 5 or paying your bills or having to keep a roof over your head or food in your mouth. I think Roddenberry's vision incorporates all that, but the I think the hard thing about the show is that the show to be successful, it is going to have to often throw itself against that vision and
Hmm.
show how like the real truth of the universe often conflicts with that.
Hmm.
Do you have anything to add before we in this episode? This is the last episode we're going to be doing for a while. I
Yeah.
do want to talk about what you think of the first season versus the second season. Did you enjoy this season more? Um, what do you think of just your general overall thoughts of season 2?
I I think that Well, first of all, I think that just this whole discussion about Roddenberry and the shift, him, Berman, and Pillar taking up more of the heavy lifting so that Roddenberry's influence is going to be less, particularly as it moves on into season 4 because he dies.
Hmm.
Um, it'll be interesting to pick up season 3 and kind of talk about that as we see the stories change and thus the
Hmm.
reflection of the writing changing. So I think it's very good you brought that up. I think, if you compare season 1 to season 2, um, we've talked about where season 1, a lot of the stories weren't that tight.
Right.
They had 2 or 3 different stories going on at the same time, which is fine. But, the way they wove in and out of each other wasn't very good. And then when we already, once we were in maybe 6 episodes to season 2, we commented to one another that, boy, the writing is a lot tighter. There might be just, one major plot line and a minor plot line, but in general, the way they were woven together was much smoother than it was in season 1. So I think that what I'm thinking, because this is the first time that I've really, doing this with you, starting to think about not being a writer per se,
Hmm.
but thinking about, well, what were the writers thinking when they did this, and how are things progressing or degressing based upon the quality of stories that our assessment of the quality of the stories and so forth. So I
Hmm.
think that season 2, since the stories are titled, it had some very interesting storylines in it and so forth. I think it's growth. It was better, quote unquote. So it'll be interesting to see how things evolve in season 3.
I think one thing that we could note about season 2 versus season 1 is that philosophically the storytelling is much more centered on the difficulty of science fiction storytelling, like the difficulty of the Prime Directive versus kind of, and I already used the episode Justice, like when is the law too restrictive versus, when is it too liberal? That is kind of too airy for one show to deal with. But
Mm-hmm.
to deal with the idea of, okay, what is your moral responsibility when you know you can save someone because you have the technology? Like in the episode Pen Pals,
Mm-hmm.
I think Pen Pals is a very good episode where it deals with like the
Mm-hmm.
moral ambiguity of the Prime Directive versus the
Right.
actual reality of what you have to deal with.
Yes.
Where, like,
Yes.
the episode like Justice, it's ridiculous from the get go because, like, a young boy accidentally fell into something that he had no clue about culturally, and you're going to put him to death. Like, it's a ridiculous premise. Um, One thing that I find there's two things I wanted to address. Um, Catherine Pulaski comes into the show as a main character, and slowly over time is relegated to get a special guest appearance. Why do you think ultimately the character of Dr. Pulaski did not work? Behind the scenes, they would actually make peace with Gates McFadden. Between her and the producer Maurice Hurley, they had had a falling out, which caused her to leave after season 1. They will make up and she will return for season 3, so we will have Beverly Crusher back. But looking at Diana Muldaur and uh, yeah, Diana, yeah, Muldaur, um, and the character of Dr. Pulaski, why do you think that she didn't work ultimately?
Um, I thought as the season went on, her interaction with her fellow actors improved, and
Yes,
so that was a plus. I think that she did
I
not.
agree with that. Yeah.
She even though she became um, you know personal with Worf and played cards with people and that sort of thing, her personality, and some of it's reflective of Diana Mulder's personality, as I recall seeing her in other work she's done, she's a little bit standoffish.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't have the connectivity, the warmth that Gates McFadden, um, presented even in season one. And then I
I
think
think,
you,
yeah,
and then I think you put, the background story is that Roddenberry didn't like Gates McFadden, and he brought Diana Muldaur in to replace her. But you know, there's probably more you can say about how she didn't work for the fans, but she may have not worked for the other, her colleagues and production staff and so forth. And then, you know, maybe was part of it is that we needed, if Wesley was going to be on the Enterprise, let's bring his mother back so we can have that interaction between the mother and son.
right. Um, I I think the failure of Dr. Pulaski comes down to a bunch of things. I think, like you said, I think that is just a miscasting. I think it is very hard to have a character walk on when you've already established the Doctor being not only integral to the relationship she has with the Captain, but also the only child character on board. Um, those two things disappear, and Dr. Pulaski had nothing really to do with Jean-Luc Picard, save one episode. And I think that's the one where I forget what it's called. It's the one where they deal with the genetically modified children,
Mm-hmm.
and they
Right,
age suddenly.
right.
Um, besides that one episode, she has no interaction with Captain Picard on a real level, which I think ultimately causes the character to suffer. Everyone has a relationship with Jean-Luc Picard on the ship, and there was never really one established with Pulaski. And I think ultimately her lack of presence in Jean-Luc Picard's storytelling is probably what spelled the end for that character. I also think there is a certain level of they just kind of wrote her antagonistic towards Data, and they put her in a lot of scenarios and situations where she was made to come across as kind of a maverick, but also kind of disregarding a lot of other things like Data's, quote unquote humanity or
She
what.
came across and sometimes as just a bitch,
Yeah, a little bit.
to be very misogynistic about it.
Yeah. We might cut that out. Um, but um, I think the difficulty of that character is you need to have the doctor of the ship, like McCoy, interacting with everyone, or at least being a constant presence. Um, Crusher seems to have been a constant presence in season one. I can't remember an episode where Beverly Crusher wasn't involved in some way, or we didn't see her on the screen. There were multiple episodes this season where Pulaski doesn't even show up. One thing that I think also is unique to season two is there's much more of an institutional examination of Starfleet. They intercede a lot more in the Enterprise's mission than they did in season one. Season one is really much more about the Enterprise going out and exploring the galaxy and meeting all these new civilizations. It seems like in season two, a lot of the stuff that the Enterprise is asked to do, from um, scientific surveys to diplomatic missions, Starfleet in season two seems to have the Enterprise running around doing a lot of things that d- don't include seeking out new life and meeting new civilizations. There's a lot of bureaucracy, it seems, in season two that the Enterprise is involved in. And it's, kind of getting back to the show Enterprise, one thing that we can say about the show that Scott Bakula helmed, that show really was about the NX-01 going out and exploring. one thing that I'm starting to see in season 2 when it comes to the Next Generation, I don't understand how the Enterprise gets around the galaxy because it seems to be going in all these different directions, doing all these different things, all the time. And I'm going to start including a link to the Alpha Quadrant, a map of the Alpha Quadrant in the description below. Um, One thing that kind of bugs me now is it seems they're going all over the map, and there's not really a lot of exploration done as much as there is monitoring, it seems. Do you am I kind of off base here, or does it seem like there's a lot less exploration in season 2 and a lot more
Yeah,
like keeping things
that's a good point because it gets into the discussion we've had about how many missions does the Enterprise have? Warship, diplomatic tool,
hospital
uh,
vessel?
hospital vessel, uh, uh, passenger ship, et cetera. All those different things, and yeah, they've done, they've this gets into they're always being diverted somewhere. It's like, well,
Right,
where are you really supposed to go? They never talk about that. It's
right.
like, oh, we got this emergency call, or we got Starfleet wants us to go off here, and they won't tell us till we get there what it's all about. So,
This was the season of emergency diversions.
emergency diversions, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, Actually, going back to what you said about Dr. Pulaski being a bitch, you're right. She is a bitch. She was mean to Data the
That's right.
entire season. Like that's not
Yeah.
misogynistic to say. She was mean to Data. Um,
She just is
wh-
what she is. Yes.
why do you think? Well, this gets back into our conversation about Roddenberry's vision. How in the future do you have a doctor that is kind of openly bigoted towards an artificial life form? Wouldn't the artificial life form still in the 24th century be, um, if we're truly so advanced socially in the 24th century, wouldn't that bigotry really be out of place and almost be offensive on a starship?
Well, that gets into the point I'm, trying to articulate. I don't think I've said it very well. Is that, in theory, you can have this vision, and it may work. In society may be very different and more cohesive than it is now for the reasons we discussed. That Earth can, you know, people on Earth, Homo sapiens, can define itself as a separate species because they know about the Vulcans, they know about the Andorians, etc., the Tellarites, etc. But it's like, as you said, it's not going to be conflict free. People
Right.
are still going to be people, but
Well,
it gets into the point I think you've described well. Is there's going to have to be a completely different mindset to how people relate to one another.
right.
It gets into the whole one of the things we talked about is if the government told us that, yeah, there really are aliens,
Yeah.
there's 6 species that we've dealt with and so forth, or per the 1952, the day the Earth stood still, the guy comes down, the ship with Klaatu comes and lands on the South Lawn and lets everybody know that, yeah, we're here and you need to start behaving yourselves. And oh, by the way, you really need to get together on this climate change shit. Um, Unless you have, if you had that sort of event, that's the kind of thing that helps people reset their whole thinking. They have to come up with a whole new sphere to encompass what reality is. And maybe that's one of the secrets to after Zephram Cochrane in 2063, the fact that, in Star Trek, you do have first contact. And thus, once the word gets out that we aren't alone, that's where the whole psychological basis from which humans work changes.
Well, can I make an observation about that? And I think it's maybe the beauty of, we've critiqued Gene Roddenberry a little bit here. I would like to probably say my last bit on something to his benefit. I think one thing about the show that we shouldn't ever take it for granted is that it really does come from a basis of hope.
Yes.
First contact with Zefram Cochrane is him shaking hands with the Vulcans. That's very different from. It's a story that starts from a place of hope. That the first time we have first contact, it's not Klaatu coming down and saying, like, you need to behave, because Klaatu's terrifying. If our first contact's terrifying, psychologically, that starts us on a path that we can't predict and probably doesn't end well for us as a species.
That's a good
I,
point.
the
Right.
tenor that we set, and I think that's what I'm trying to say here, the tenor that we set into the future really is going to determine, as much as our stated intentions, the course
Oh,
that we
yeah.
ultimately take.
Well, yes, it's a good point because, again, going into other science fiction, if you have a very benign, positive first contact,
Mm-hmm.
that sets things one way. If you have a non benign, destructive first contact, like what happened in the Tom Cruise version of um, what movie am I talking about?
Edge of Tomorrow?
No, when the Martians come.
Oh, War of the Worlds. Yeah.
War of the Worlds. I mean, obvious, that version, that Tom Cruise version, where he was, the star and so forth, is very different from. Well, it's shot differently and so forth because it's different time compared to the radio show that Orson Welles did, but the outcome's the same. If something like that happened, the mindset of how humans or how the human psyche would be reset would be very, very different. It might even produce negative endorphins. You know.
Exactly. And on that note, I think we'll end
Okay.
it for tonight. Dad, thank you so much for joining me for another great season of Star Trek: The Next Generation. This has been a wonderful show to do with you, and where no
Thank.
Bubs
Yes,
gone before is a real joy in my life, and I hope it has been for you, and
it
I hope it has
has.
been for the people listening.
Yes. Thanks, Jay.
Okay. Night, everyone. We'll see you again for season 3 real soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye.